example of that when we do our demonstration batches. But essentially, if you have a really good hood over your stove at home, a lot of times you can roast on your hood in your kitchen. If you have one of those fancy hoods that just blows the smoke back over your shoulder, you're probably going to want to roast outside. And if you like really dark roasted coffee, you might want to roast outside. But for the most part, it's not a huge amount of smoke, so we'll cover that. So we have heat, we have movement. We're going to mitigate the smoke and chaff. And then the final piece of the puzzle is cooling. Once you get the coffee roasted to that perfect level, you want to get it cooled down as quick as possible. Which sounds like it could be complicated, but it's really as simple as dumping the coffee into a mesh basket like this or a metal colander and just shaking it. Anything you can do to pass air over the coffee will cool it, but the idea is to cool it down as quick as possible. And that's how you go about roasting coffee. Any questions? Well, that's all I have. Yes, sir.
I actually got one. So
yep.
You can have a roaster this big, or you can have one this big, but it's the same principle.
Same exact principle, yeah.
All right.
It's pretty fascinating. So how you go about solving those four problems? Like I said, you can be as creative as you want. There's many ways you can do it. The most basic form would be to do it in a simple frying pan. It's the way the Ethiopians do it. If you go to a lot of good Ethiopian restaurants and you ask them to do the coffee ceremony for you, they'll break out a little cast iron skillet and a little charcoal fire, and they'll actually roast coffee right at your table. So doing it in the frying pan, the heat source would come from like a gas stove or an electric stove. Movement's going to come from you and a wooden spoon stirring the coffee, and that's going to get that even roast. The smoke and the chaff are going to come off at different points in the process, and we'll kind of cover that in a minute. And then cooling would come from a metal colander. So super easy. When you get into actual machines that roast coffee, then there's two basic forms. Let me step back and say there's what we call a manual way to roast coffee, and then there's what we call an automatic way to roast coffee. Not to imply that there's any such thing as a fully automatic coffee roaster, but the automatics automate some of the processes. So the full manuals would be like frying pans or something like that, whereas an automatic roaster is going to take over some of those aspects for you. And when you get into the automatics, there's two variations. There's what's known as a fluidized bed roaster. Both of these would be example of fluidized bed coffee roasters. And what they're going to do is they're going to use a fluid bed of hot air. That fluid bed of air is going to move up through the bean mass. It's going to be what provides the heat to the coffee. It's going to be what provides the movement. And then as it passes through the bed of beans, it's going to remove the smoke and chaff. They're pretty quick, usually fairly inexpensive and easy to get your hands on. The other variation would be a drum roaster. This guy right here is a mini version of those big fancy drum roasters you see at like Kova and places like that. Drum roasters typically have like a gas or electric burner. That's going to provide your heat. They have a drum that rotates in the middle. The rotating drum is going to be what provides the movement. And there's typically a low flow fan involved that pulls the smoke and chaff off the coffee and out of the roaster. Drum roasters, you can typically do a lot more volume, but they're typically a lot more expensive as well. So my personal favorite for roasting coffee at home is a good old hot air popcorn popper. Not super sexy by any means, especially after you use it for a little bit, but as far as an inexpensive way to go about roasting coffee, popcorn poppers do a great job. We got this guy for $2.99 at the Goodwill. We put about 200 pounds of coffee through it, so another year or two and we might recoup our investment. Yeah, if we're lucky.
How did you clean that out, considering that there may have been butter and et cetera, in there?
I didn't.
Okay.
The good news is that when you roast coffee in a popcorn popper, you're operating well above the temperatures that it was designed for, so it's going to cook off any of that butter and oil. One or two batches and it doesn't smell like popcorn anymore.
Which might not be a bad thing.
Buttered coffee? Yeah, if you're really concerned about it, you can just wipe it out with like Simple Green or whatever, but yeah, one or two batches and it'll be all clean. The unfortunate thing is that not all popcorn poppers are created equal. So especially with the brand new hot air popcorn poppers you can pick up at like Fred Meyer's or Target, most of those aren't capable of roasting coffee. They just don't get hot enough. They have technology in them that shuts them off before they get to the temperatures that we need to roast coffee. So if you can get your hands on an older one, if you can get your hands on one of these guys, West Bend Poppery 2 or its cousin, the original Poppery, They're kind of the gold standard of coffee roasters. I've seen these go. You laugh. I've seen these go for up to $60 on Craigslist and over $100 on eBay. Exactly. Yes.
Sorry, I have that at home, but I don't ever use it for popcorn.
You're sitting on a gold mine.
I don't want to use it myself.
These are great, yeah. So if you get your hands on one of these, then it's almost assured that it's going to work. But even then, you know, you never know if it's going to pop or be able to roast coffee until you put coffee in it and try. So, but older is better. The other thing, and I'll pass these around too. This one is just one that we removed the plastic coating, so you can kind of see what the insides look like. But there's two kind of variations of popcorn poppers. There's this variation here that has metal fins around the inside of the chamber. And that's kind of what you want to look for. If you get your hands on one of those, it's going to do a much better job than this type here, which has kind of a mesh screen at the bottom of the roast chamber. So pass those around. You can take a quick look at those. But so if you find an older one and you find one that has those metal fins around the inside, then the next step is just throw coffee in it and see what happens. So, pretty easy process when you're roasting in a popcorn popper. Then and the stuff isn't going to make sense until we get to the demonstration, but bear with me for another second or two. So the method of roasting in a popcorn popper is essentially to plug it into the wall. Most of them don't have on-off switches, strangely enough. Plug it in the wall and it goes. Put your coffee beans in it. You might have to stir it for the first 30 seconds or so, and then you just let the coffee go until it's as dark as you want it, and you dump it into your colander to cool it. And I'll explain exactly how you know all that stuff in a second. And again, with the air roasters, then the air is going to move up through the bean bed. It's going to provide the heat to the coffee. It's going to be what moves the coffee around. And as it passes through the bed, it's going to remove the smoke and chaff. So if you're roasting somewhere, like your kitchen, where you don't really want all this chaff blowing around, then you can leave the hood on it, and it will allow you to direct where the chaff is going to go. So when we were roasting at home, we invented this patented chaff collection system here. We would just set this on our stove, turn our extractor hood on, chaff would go into the box here, and smoke would go outside. And you'd get a little bit of particulate drifting around on your stove, but it wasn't any more than dust. So super easy way to go. The whole process takes somewhere in the 5 to 8 minute range, depending on how dark you like your coffee roasted. And in popcorn poppers, they'll roast it anywhere from an eighth to a quarter pound. So not a ton of coffee, but for most people, 2 or 3 batches is more than enough to get you through a week. So if you're roasting someplace where you don't need to worry about the chaff blowing around, you can absolutely roast with the hood off and just let the chaff blow around. My little brother roasts outside on his back patio, and there's just chaff. He likes it.
Does it affect the temperature?
What's that?
From the hood on?
Yes. By removing the hood, you remove some of the resistance, so it can allow the popper to run a little bit cooler. So, which may or may not be a benefit, depends on your popper. So, but there you go. Super easy, and we'll do a demonstration batch in this guy here in a second to prove that you can actually do it. So, he's a liar. He's making it up.
Okay, so how did you come up with 400 degrees? Obviously, these don't have thermostats on them. It's just...
It's a very good question. Nice segue, by the way. So we'll do a quick demonstration batch and answer your question. The reason why I do the demonstration batch in this guy is not because I want you to buy one of these, although I do want you to invest in one of these. You got 2 kids, college, right? So, just kidding. But I do a demonstration batch in here because it's got this really nice picture window here. So you're going to be able to see the coffee as it's roasting, and I can kind of explain what we're seeing and how you use that to roast coffee in any device. This is what's known as a Fresh Roast SR500. It's kind of one of the entry-level coffee roasters. Does about a quarter pound, and it's a fluidized bed coffee roaster. So super easy. I'm going to get this guy started and walk you through the actual roasting process here. It is kind of noisy, so bear with me. I'm not yelling at you. I'm just trying to talk over the machine. So, let me get some coffee here. And any questions before we jump into this stage here? Yes, sir.
Where do you find your green beans?
Do
you sell them?
Yes, we do.
You do?
We sell, strangely enough, we have about 40 varieties of raw coffee at our shop on Mississippi, and we get them from all over the world. So they're from Indonesia, Africa, and South and Central America. Yes, ma'am.
So,
I'm looking at, you were talking about doing it in skillet, you're talking about doing it here with air.
Hmm?
And are you going to lose any of the volatiles if you're pumping that much air over your beans as opposed to roasting them without
Not-
air movement in a pan?
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, you lose some, but you lose moisture for the most part. You don't lose a lot of the volatiles. They're all trapped inside the coffee bean. So, uh-oh.
What's a volatile?
I don't know. What's a volatile?
A volatile is a low molecular weight aromatic, so it's what you're going to find is like flavors. So you're going to lose some of the lighter weight molecules when you run a lot of air over it, so you'll lose some of the flavors.
Well done. In coffee, then most of those are trapped in the oil that's embedded inside the coffee bean. So as long as you don't roast it super dark, then the oil stays trapped inside the coffee, and most of it isn't affected by air. The air is just transferring the heat to the coffee. So
Is that why the Starbucks beans look so shiny but taste so bad?
you're gonna make me trash Starbucks on live TV. In Starbucks' defense, they don't roast their coffee super dark. Starbucks' biggest mistake, and it's solely based off of distribution, is their coffee's really old. And we'll cover this after I'm done roasting. But as coffee ages, then the oils go rancid. Same thing, once they're affected by oxygen, they go rancid. Once the coffee oils go rancid, it doesn't taste good. So, and that's what anybody that's selling coffee that's more than, in my humble, non-outspoken opinion, 10 days old, then it starts to taste old, in my opinion. And Starbucks lets their coffee go for 7 months before they have to sell it. So when Stumptown first came on the market, they would not let anybody sell their coffee after 10 days. So, and that's why everybody loves Stumptown coffee, because it was fresh. So fresh roasted coffee just tastes 100 times better. So.
Is it the aging that happens from the moment you roast the beans until you use them, or
Yep.
does it aging happen before you roast?
There's a little bit of aging that happens. Raw coffee is shelf stable for the most part. Keep it cool and dry and out of direct sunlight, and it's going to last 6 months to a year. Once it's roasted, you're looking at 7 to 10 days. So,
Is that the same for decaffeinated green bean?
for the most part, yeah. I mean, you're getting into the weeds there, but yeah, for the most part. Decaffeinated has already been trashed. If you have to do it though, fresh roasted decaffeinated is not half bad. All right, you ready to roast some coffee? Sure.
Is there like, so you get your beans, 1,500-pound bag or the big bag or whatever, is like there a moisture you're doomed before you start, you know? The beans are wet?
No. So, I mean, that's a very technical question. But essentially the coffee is stabilized before it's shipped, so it goes into what they call repose. The coffee is picked, it's dried on beds at origin. They dry it until it's a specific moisture content, and then they put it into big silos and they let it sit until all the coffee beans have the same moisture content, and then it's bagged up and shipped to us. So unless the coffee's been treated really, really poorly, it's a very stable product. Just like rice, legumes, anything like that. It's, unless you're putting it in a place that's got really high humidity or it's actually getting water on it, then the coffee isn't going to absorb too much from the air, as long as it's got fresh air moving over it. So.
Do you have any suggestions to people, like let's say they don't live in Portland, or they aren't of any other sources for green? Because for me, like up until we contacted you, I know there was a few, like I hadn't really heard of it too much.
Yeah, it's kind of not the most well-known thing in the world. So, but there's a ton of websites that sell raw coffee beans, and ethnic stores. Ethiopians, they roast their own coffee. That's what they do. So good Ethiopian stores. A lot of I'm going to butcher it, but the halal markets. A lot of those markets sell raw coffee beans. So there's tons of places where you can actually get the raw coffee if you ask for it. Most places sell 1 or 2 varieties. If you want a lot of varieties, then guys like me, or there's a bunch of websites like Sweet Maria's and places like that just have tons and tons of options. So we're definitely not the only people selling it, but there's lots of places to get it. So.
What prompted you to dive as deep into this subject as you've gotten?
Getting way off topic here. We've been home roasters for years, and we roasted our own coffee just because we really liked the flavor. We learned about it from a class like this, just out of curiosity. We said, oh, roast your own coffee at home, that sounds interesting. We took a class, and we roasted coffee the next morning, and it tasted better than what we'd had any time before that, and we haven't gone back. And then I lost my job, and so it was like, hey, what can I do to make a living? So here I am, trying to convince other people to roast their own coffee. That's the short story. But mostly it came from us taking a class like this, which is kind of cool. Any other questions?
Roast, Daddy-o.
All right. We've been commanded. This young lady would like her question answered. How do you know how you're roasting coffee? So we're going to do a demonstration batch here. Like I said, I'm going to walk you through the actual process and should answer all the rest of your questions and we can go home. This little machine has a built-in timer. Time is a very ineffective way to roast coffee. I wasn't ready for it to make noise. So time ends up being a very ineffective way to roast coffee. This timer that's built into this machine is simply a fail-safe. It's there to keep the roaster from burning up. So we're going to run it up to 9.9 and then we're pretty much going to ignore it from this point forward. So, welcome. Grab a seat. You're here for the exciting part. Right, so I'm going to put some coffee in here and we'll go to town. So you can see that the coffee at this point doesn't look like what most of us know to be coffee. The beans are kind of small and green. They're very dense and hard at this point. You can see they're barely moving around. And if you pay attention to where they fall compared to the stainless steel line, it'll make a good description here in a minute. But essentially the roasting process is going to reduce the moisture content of the coffee. So the beans are going to lose up to 25% of their weight, and they're going to gain up to 40% in size. So throughout the roasting process, then we're going to see these beans get a lot bigger and plumper. They're also going to go through a dramatic color change. So they start out green, they're going to go into yellows, into golds, onto brown colors, and eventually black if you went far enough. So throughout that whole color changing, gaining in weight, and losing size process, the bean, there's going to be two audible cracks that we're going to hear. They're creatively named the first crack and the second crack. We're going to have a lot of time with it. I don't know how they came up with those, but they spent some time figuring that out. But the cracks are going to be your surest guide, and it's the most consistent way to go about roasting coffee, sort of actually knowing what the actual temperature of the coffee is. So the cracks come at a very consistent point in the bean's life based off of temperature. So once the beans hit a certain internal bean temperature, they crack for the first time. Once they hit another certain bean temperature, then they crack for the second time. So it's a very consistent way to go about roasting coffee. And it doesn't matter if you're doing it in a basic frying pan or a big fancy commercial roaster. You're going to get that same first crack and the same second crack. So it's super consistent. You can see the beans are starting to change color at this point. Essentially, hopefully anyways, we're going to go, turn the noise down a little bit. We're going to go from this green color into yellows onto gold. And right about the point where we go from a golden color to a light brown is going to be when we get the first crack. And the first crack is going to be a lot like popcorn popping. It's going to be a good strong snap, snap, snap. Each of the beans is going to crack one time during the first crack. So much like popcorn, you're going to get a pop here, a pop there. It'll pick up pace a little bit, and then it's going to taper off. So each one of the beans is going to crack one time. What's happening during the first crack is as the beans are drying out, it's building up pressure on the seam down the middle of the coffee bean. So if you look at green coffee beans compared to roasted coffee, then the beans are very tight, and as they plump up and dry out, then they build up pressure on that seam and it actually pops open. If you have these sitting on like a tray or something when they crack, you can see them pop like popcorn and then close right back up. It's kind of cool. But each of the beans will do that one time. They got a little ways to go here, but you can see that they've gone from the green color through the yellows and they're working their way into the gold. The way flavor of coffee is going to work is the closer we are to the first crack, well first off, from the first crack forward is the palatable stage for coffee. So once you get into the first crack, from that point forward you can shut it down at any point and it's going to taste like coffee. Whether or not you like it is a matter of personal preference, but it's coffee at that point. The way the flavor works is the closer you are to the first crack, then the more of the origin character of the coffee you're going to taste. So the type of tree that it was, the type of soil that the tree was grown in, how the fruit was processed, all those flavors are going to come out the closer you are to that first crack. So if you like a really light roast with very vibrant fruit flavors, you're going to want to be on the lighter side closer to the first crack. As the coffee gets darker and gets closer to the second crack, then we start to add what we call roast character. Roast character is going to be the caramelized sugars, kind of the deeper, darker, heavier flavor. So if you like your coffee to taste like brownies, you'd want to be a little closer to the second crack. We should be getting close to the first crack at this point. A little bit longer.
But the volume increased by 25% or something.
Yeah, you'll gain about 40% total as the coffee gets roasted. So it'll nearly double in size. Depending on how dark you roast it, anywhere from 16 to 25%. The light roast obviously would be in the 16%, a very dark roast would be in the 25%.
And this room, did you cover second crack?
Excuse me?
Have we talked about the second crack?
Not yet. Kind of help you with the first crack.
What kind of dark light process is it?
It's kind of I don't know if you can smell it, but you're going to start to be able to smell the actual roasting process. It's not really producing any smoke at this point, mostly steam. But as we get closer to the first crack, then we'll start to get into a little bit of the smoke. At this point, it just smells like cookies.
If we were putting this in a cast iron skillet with the lid, would we be shaking it like we would when we do popcorn?
If you have the endurance to shake a cast iron skillet,
Or would you be stirring it?
I last about 2 minutes on that. But yeah, you would either stir anything to create movement. So like I said, if you can do it, shaking's a great way to do it. But a lot of people use a wooden spoon and stir.
Okay, I think off lid, I have a popcorn popper.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is that what I would be using for this to all the ventilation?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to do it. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but that's the first crack going. Stop. Can you guys all hear that? So that's the first crack. So the first crack, they're both cracking sounds, but the first crack is definitely different than the second crack. Again, it sounds more like popcorn popping. It's a stronger snap, snap, pop, pop. And after you hear it a couple times, then it's super easy to tell the two apart. But I don't know if you noticed, but the first crack kind of started like a pop, 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 and then there was a pause in the action, and then there was more popping. That wasn't the first crack and the second crack. That was just the first crack kind of rolling forward. So you wouldn't want to get confused there and hear like, oh, I heard a crack. That's the first crack, and then oh, I heard another crack. That's the second crack. It's getting darker. Where in fact you're just in the middle of the first crack. So after a time or two, then you can easily tell the difference between the two. But when you first start roasting, then it helps to pay attention to the actual color of the coffee as well. At this point, you can tell the beans are a very light brown. As we get closer to the second crack, they're going to turn into more like a dark chocolate. And your question was if how quick the process went affected the crack? Yes and no. You really get into the science of the roasting process there. You can change the flavor a little bit by how quickly or how slowly you roast it at different points in the process. But it's really getting into the science of it. So, it's a long conversation. What's that? No, it's not. So the first crack is pretty much done at this point. You can see the beans are still growing inside. It's almost filling up the tube there. And we're going to start working our way towards the second crack. So the second crack is going to start much like the first crack did, with a tick here and tick there, but it's going to sound more like Rice Krispies and milk, or if you've ever heard pine noodles burning, it's going to sound more like that, more of a tick, tick, tick. So it'll start like the first crack did, with a tick here, a tick there. It's going to build up in speed, but unlike the first crack, it doesn't stop. Once it starts, it keeps going. So you're starting to get a couple ticks of the first crack at this point. It always starts with a tick here, a tick there, another tick, tick. So you can use the second crack, like the first time you hear a tick of the second crack, you can shut it down there and it'd be just before the second crack. If you let it go, it's kind of ticking sporadically now, but those ticks are going to come until they're coming steady. You can shut it down at that point and it'd be just into the second crack. So right now they're coming steady. Let me stop when I say that. Can you guys all hear that? You can tell how different than the first crack was? So So it's going to keep going until that crack is just coming rapid. And from this point forward, the longer you go, the more smoke you're going to get. If you go to a really dark roast, you're going to have smoke coming out of your ears. I'm going to go ahead and shut it down here, mostly because I'm tired of yelling. So what I did is I just kicked it into a cool mode, and it should cool the coffee down fairly quickly, and then we'll turn it off.
Why do you think it's cool off?
Much like cooking any food, if you were to just take the coffee out of the roaster and dump it into a colander and let it sit, the beans on the inside would continue to cook. So you'd end up with a much darker roast than you intended. So much like a steak, yes. You want to pull it out and get it cooled down as quick as possible, so that you end up with the same roast level as you want. And I'm not going to do that because I really get tired of the noise. Turn this off, take this out of here. And, oops, I'll put this in there. It's still kind of hot. Normally I'd let this run through the whole cooling cycle, but like I said, I get kind of tired of yelling. So I'll pass this around. You guys can smell this. Don't touch the beans, they're still kind of warm. And then I'll pass that around and you can take a sniff of that one as well.
So once they cool, is there like a curing, like paint or like a setting, like a cake?
Absolutely.
Before you would...
It's like I planted you there to just ask the Absolutely. As I'm demonstrating with the aroma here, and once you... I don't get paid, so... Once you pull the beans out of the roaster, then they don't necessarily smell like you would expect them to smell. They just smell kind of hot, like burnt toast. It doesn't have that fresh roasted aroma that you're probably hoping for. That coffee was roasted about 2 hours ago.
Different, really
yeah.
different.
Slap the lid back on when you pass it around.
So what's the optimal amount of time from the moment it comes out of the roaster to when you should brew the coffee?
Subjective. Typically 12 to 24 hours is a good starting point. Some coffees do better, closer to like 72, 48, someplace like that. But 12 to 24 is a good starting point. So it really depends on the coffee and what you're using as a brewing method.
So wait, it is.
Yeah, so back to answering your question. So immediately after you get it out of the roaster, then like I said, they just smell kind of hot. So at this point, they're off-gassing CO2. So you'd want to get them out of the roaster, get them cooled down as quick as possible, and then just let them sit in the open air and get as much of that CO2 off them as possible. Best 1 to 4 hours of just letting them sit in the open air, unless you have some sort of a container that can act as a one-way valve. Mason jars, it's passing around, work great. Put the lid on a little loose and it acts like a nice one-way valve. It'll let the CO2 out, but it won't let oxygen back in. So 1 to 4 hours after it's roasted, you want to let them sit and get as much CO2 out of them as possible. And then after that, you're going to want to put them in an airtight container and let it sit for 12 to 24 hours. So 12 to 24 hours after it's been roasted, then it's going to hit its peak of freshness, and it will maintain that freshness for 7 to 14 days, depending on how you store it. There's some coffee roasters in Portland that are throwing darts at me right now. But it's all right.
So in this cooling, just leave it in the stove or put it out in a cookie sheet?
Anything you can do to dissipate the heat. Yep, anything you can do to dissipate the heat. Spreading it on a cookie sheet obviously dissipates the heat really quick. If you have a good fan, like a downdraft, you can stick it over your downdraft and just pull a massive amount of air over the coffee. That'll cool them down really quick. You can take a box fan, put it over a box fan. Anything you can do to pass air over the coffee and cool it down. Once it's to the point where you can hold it in your hand and it's not really giving off a lot of heat, then you can just let it sit and it'll be fine. So, the idea is just to get it below its roasting level as quick as possible. So, yeah, airtight container. Once it's roasted, airtight container and in a cool, dry location. So you wouldn't want to stick it in a window that's getting like the noonday sun. And you wouldn't want to stick it in like a cabinet that's got a heater blowing against it or something like that. So cool
all
and dry.
the stuff about storing in the freezer, that's hoo-ha?
I don't know that it's hoo-ha, but you don't really gain anything. So it's kind of like it's a net zero, so why do it? If you have like, say you roasted up some really amazing Colombian geisha, and then you got called out of town on business, absolutely triple bag it and throw it in the freezer. But for day-to-day use, you would lose more by constantly taking it in and out of the freezer than you would gain by storing it in the freezer. So just cool and dry and in an airtight container. And like I said, mason jars work great. Put the ring on a little loose, and it'll allow the beans to burp out any CO2, but it won't allow oxygen back in. So, yes, ma'am?
So that machine obviously drew the chaff out of the beans and we weren't able to see it. At what point do we expect that to come off? So if I'm roasting in a pan
Good question. So that's the chaff that it generated. So like she said, this has a fancy little chaff collector, so you don't really see it coming off. And I neglected to point it out while it was actually roasting. But typically when the beans start to turn gold, you'll start to see the chaff start to flake off. So from the gold level until just after the first crack is when the majority of the chaff is released. You get a blast when the beans pop open during the first crack, and from that point forward, there's not a lot left.
So if I had that in a frying pan, it wouldn't matter if I left that in until the beans were finished roasting?
Nope. In the frying pan method, or like a popcorn popper method like you were talking about, a manual popcorn popper, then the chaff just stays in during the roasting process. So you'd roast your coffee, you might get a little bit of it floating around as you're stirring the coffee, but when you went to cool the coffee would be when you would mitigate that chaff. So you dump it into a colander that would allow the chaff to fall through. So big hole.
Is the chaff bitter? I mean, if you aren't able to separate it,
It would be really hard to get enough chaff into the into your roasted coffee to affect the flavor. So the biggest thing it's going to do is going to make a mess out of your grinder. Coffee beans themselves are prone to static, as some of you probably know really well, and the chaff is 100% more prone to static than the coffee, so it just sticks to your coffee grinder. But it's not going to affect the flavor of your coffee. But for the frying pan method or any method where the chaff is going to stay in during the roasting process, then a colander with good sized holes like this is what you want to use. So dump them into it, shake it, all the chaff is going to fall through like that. So does that answer your question? Any questions about the roasting process? Did the cracks make sense to everybody? First crack, second crack. Did I do a decent job of describing how the flavors are affected by the roasting process? Does that make sense?
So would you generally want to stop at the second crack, or would you ever want to go beyond that?
That's up to you. And I think people are going to throw darts at me again, but I don't believe that there's a right or wrong way to roast coffee. It's really personal preference. As long as you know what you're doing and you know that you like that, then great. So if you know that you like a really dark roast, then absolutely go into the second crack a little ways. When you're new to roasting, one thing I would say is don't expect your coffee to look the way it did when you were buying it at the store immediately out of the roaster. So if you look at this coffee now, it's pretty flat. There's not a lot of oil on this. 24 hours from now, this is going to be a very oily coffee. So when you're roasting it, you don't want to roast it to the same color and oiliness that you were used to buying it at the grocery store, because that's going to come with a couple days of rest.
So this is just trial and error about your own flavor. So stop at the second crack and then experiment as time goes on to find that.
Yeah, most people
shade.
have a general idea of what they like, whether it's I really like a light roast or I like a dark roast. So that's your first. Like, start with what you know you like. If you know you like a dark roast, then you're going to want to go at least a little ways into the second crack. If you know you like a really, really dark roast, then you're going to want to go a lot farther into the second crack. If you know that you like a light roast, don't go into the second crack. And then kind of go from there.
Years ago, I'd done reading on this, and essentially I read that you don't want to do this indoors because the smoke is so awful, and you'll never get your kitchen back. But
No.
I didn't see it. Is that only if you go to espresso?
Only if you go really, really dark. Ooh, you're opening another can of worms there. Yeah, as long as you don't roast it really dark, there isn't a ton of smoke. We'll do it in the popcorn popper, and there'll be more smoke out of the popcorn popper. This blows a lot of air through the coffee, so it dissipates the smoke. You can probably smell it and feel it on your eyes. It's in the air in here for sure, but it's not enough to like cause any problems. So we roasted for years in our kitchen, and the next day you couldn't tell that we roasted coffee. So as long as you don't go super dark, if you're roasting in a frying pan or something like that, where the beans and the chaff and everything are in contact with the heat the whole time, you're going to have a lot more smoke, and it's not going to be as aromatically pleasing as, say, in an air roaster. So there are variations of that, but for the most part, if you have a decent hood over your stove or a decent way to evacuate the smoke, then yeah, you can roast inside. If you don't have a decent way to evacuate the smoke, don't roast inside. Mike joke about opening a can of worms. Espresso is merely a way to brew coffee, and it's not a way to roast coffee. So you can take a very light roasted coffee and you can pull shots through an espresso machine. It's just going to change the way. So when you say, an espresso roast, that doesn't, like, just roasting dark doesn't make it work for espresso. And I would highly recommend trying coffee a little bit lighter roasted through an espresso machine. It can come out pretty amazing. So just my own outspoken opinion.
What's your preferred method of coffee preparation past the roasting, the grinding, and the extraction, all that?
Again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's all personal preference, and I highly recommend just trying multiple ways. My preferred method is pour over through a paper filter. I just like a clean, sweet cup of coffee. But everybody has their own taste buds, and everybody knows what they like. So best you can do is just go to different coffee shops for people that brew different ways and try different things. You'll zero in on what you like. So the roasting process made sense? All right. I was going to say something and I completely forgot what it was. So, again about the oils. So, don't roast the coffee until it looks like the way you're used to buying it. And the reason why is as coffee ages, it's going to continue to change. So, if you're used to seeing really oily coffee, oil is a function of two things. It's a function of how dark the coffee was roasted initially, and it's a function of how old the coffee is when you go to use it. So. Even a light roasted coffee, if you let it sit long enough, is going to have oil in it. So, and those oils are what go rancid. So the more oil you have on your coffee, you're probably going to want to use it a lot sooner because it's going to go rancid a lot quicker. So, and then the last piece of advice is don't grind your coffee until immediately before you're going to brew it. Again, all the flavor and aromatics are trapped inside the coffee bean, as long as the oil is trapped inside the coffee bean. So once you grind it, you release all those oils to be affected by oxygen. So